So, if we've pushed this pawn all the way to e5, the way that we should justify it is not just by pushing every single pawn so we have as much space as possible in that naive sense that more pawn advance means more space. We want to control these critical squares very well. So the e5 square is what I would consider critical. We've already staked a claim. We're saying we're putting a pawn on e5. We're not going to let you ever put a pawn on e5, which would be a freeing advance. That's why usually people play e5 on move 1. And so it's very logical to continue with a move like d4. Also, Vedanto's asking, when am I going to do a simul again? I'm not sure exactly when I'm going to do a simul because I'm pretty busy, especially in the summer. But I will keep you guys posted when I'm going to do another simul. You can check that out in my Discord. Alright, so d4 makes a lot of sense. But we're watching one of my games from when I was not that good. I would say I was terrible, but that's not doing myself any justice. This game was from 2013. And in 2013, I didn't even have like an inkling that I would become a chess coach and take chess seriously. I just was kind of casually decent at it, and so I played a couple tournaments and had a good time, and that's how I got here eventually, I guess. So I played c4, which is a good question. Yeatermaster was asking, what about c4? Speak of the devil, right? And it appears. c4, it attacks the knight. It comes with a tempo that's very tempting, especially if you are coming up in a chess tradition that says that developing your pieces while attacking and chasing your opponent's pieces is nice. So it's tempting in that sense, and that's what I played. And you get to play d4 anyway. Looks great. We've pushed so many pawns. We've used 3 pawns. They've used only 1 knight. And you could argue that a knight on b6 is a poorly placed piece. There's a very fair argument for that. I don't remember what famous player it was who said that a lot. It was probably Tarrasch or Tarako. I always get those guys confused. They said that a knight on b6 is like the worst placed knight. So, by pushing all these pawns, I'm kind of declaring something similar. I'm saying I'm going to take over all these squares. I'm not going to let you use any of these squares that I put pawns on. I'm going to support these pawns, and your knight's going to look silly as a result. However, when you push all these pawns without developing any of your pieces, black starts to get some play if they choose accurate moves. So I'd like to open this up for you guys to give some input in the chat. What do you guys think black should do to capitalize on their position where white has maybe taken too much space? How do we start undermining? I think there's probably 1 or 2 moves that are strongly worth considering, but there's mainly one move that I think is completely correct. If you know the opening theory, also feel free to just tell the next move in the opening theory. There's nothing wrong with knowing it ahead of time. Alright, so Yeatermaster says d5. Ari Morrison says the same. So that's interesting. Let's say we play d5. Probably this is like an equalizing move if white takes it, right? Because if they take it, then black will be able to occupy the d5 square, and it's an outpost square. So that would be very nice. At least black will have 1 active piece no matter what happens from here on. But what if white plays c5? This looks maybe a little bit awkward for white as well, because you are fixing all of your pawns in some sense. They can't advance anymore without getting taken. And when we put our pawns on these squares and they can't move, it means that white pieces can't occupy those squares. However, it's also chasing this knight, so the knight probably has to go back to d7. I'm very suspicious of knight c4, because if bishop takes c4, pawn takes c4, that pawn will get weak. And on top of that, we can play b3 and chase the knight again. So I think knight b d7 is forced. And in this position, you can see that black's pieces aren't coming out anytime soon. Like, let's say we play knight c3. You have to support this d pawn. If you lose it, I think it's going to be bad. We looked at another line where we trade weaknesses, but in this case, it doesn't work. Like, let's say you play... well, first of all, I think you should play e6 maybe. But let's say you play g6. After knight takes d5, you would like to do a discover attack using the queen. However, whenever you take a pawn, we also do a discover defense. So it doesn't quite work out. I think that in this example, you can see how black is getting crushed by white's space. The space advantage is stable. There's no challenge to these pawns. They can attack them with pawn lever moves like b6 and f6, but we can support them with f4 and b4. And it seems like there's not really any challenge, mainly because black's pieces are not playing in the attack on the pawns. So d5 would normally be a freeing advance, like if we do this. I guess knight takes is the best move. However, white is not forced to do that. They would probably keep pushing and gain more space. And it's a stable space advantage, very hard to undermine. That's a really important detail for what we're talking about today. The move's d6. So the idea with d6 is to immediately challenge white's farthest advanced pawn. A famous chess dude once said that you should attack a pawn chain at the head or the base. So if we're thinking of this as one chain, we can attack d4 or e5. It's a very short chain, so we could say we can attack it anywhere we want. I don't really find that aphorism very useful, but it's what's happening here. We're challenging the pawn structure by playing d6. Additionally, d6 is a useful move. We want to develop this bishop somehow. So what do you guys think about e6? This looks very similar to d6. Is it the right kind of move to play here? What's your first instinct? I mean, we already saw that d6 is good, so maybe it's a given that e6 is not as good, but do you guys think it's playable? Does it make sense? All right, Vedant says no. Why not, Vedant? All right, he says no because d6 is better, of course. All right, Eatermaster made an interesting observation. He said it's not good because the knight is trapped after c5. However, the knight can go on d5. Don't forget, that's important. And Ari says it's playable. Okay, so we have all three results. Interesting. So let's start with Eatermaster's move, c5. Giving the outpost square is very useful. Maybe I'll show one detail here. After a move like knight c3, challenging the outpost knight, which is a very reasonable plan, I think that black can still play d6 and try to break up the center. And here's an interesting motif. If we trade, and then more trades keep happening, eventually the d5 pawn will regain its protection. Like the c5 pawn is under attack, so they might trade it. And now the queen is lined up with the d pawn again. So this is a pretty common operation. You temporarily get doubled pawns, but then you challenge the advanced pawns to undouble the other pawn. This happens also in some variations of the Sicilian defense. But e6 itself is not good, because if you play a different move, like for example, simple knight c3, we're developing a piece, we're controlling more one of the squares that we staked out as our own. Here, black is suffering for a lack of piece play. We would like to use this bishop to fight for the center. White's pawns are on dark, so you would think that's not really possible. But white will eventually have to support the pawns with knight f3. So we would really wish to play bishop g4 so we can indirectly fight for the center by trading for a knight. With a pawn on e6, we can't do that. It's not going to happen. So e6 is actually completely bad. Alan's played a short match with someone like years ago where they insisted on playing e6, and I loved it. I won every single game. So I'm sure you guys can too. So d6 is the main thing. I played f4, and this is called a 4-pawn attack against Alekhine Defense. And back in 2013, I played a 4-pawn attack against everything. I would just push all my pawns, say get at me, and then I would develop all my pieces later once I had restricted my opponent's play as much as humanly possible. However, as you guys probably know, there's some common sense wisdom that we shouldn't just use our pawns, right? We need to also employ our other pieces. if we don't use the higher value pieces, we will eventually get under attack ourselves, because the knights, bishops, whatever, all those pieces, they exert a much greater influence than the pawns. You have to start using them eventually. So f4 is already like a tenuous move. In almost any position where you make 4-pawn, 5-pawn moves in a row, it's suspicious. Whenever your opponent starts doing that, you should start looking for ways to break down their structure. So, in this position, how should black begin breaking down white's structure? I think there might be more than one good move, so I'm interested to see what you guys say. Mysterious AU says, "Yer." I'm glad you agree. Alright, Vedant's asking, how do I highlight squares and things in different colors? I kind of just like do the Rachmaninoff thing on my keyboard. I just like press different keys and eventually it works. Like, let me see. I can never remember, I just do it automatically. So regular is green, Alt is blue, Shift is red, Control is also red, and yellow is something else. Alt Shift. So there you go. The real lesson today. How do you make different color arrows on light chess? Alright, so how are we going to break down this center? What's the move? You don't have to see super far ahead, you just have to get the idea. Yeah, Ari's got the idea. You just take on e5. Yeah, no one plays this. This is a bad line. But the concept will take you very far because it's actually generally applicable. We're going to see examples that are not in this opening later on. But first I want to show you two of my fails and then how white ought to play, and then we'll look at some different lines. So after d takes e5, f takes e5, this is already an improvement for black because now they have this open file to attack the d pawn. And there's one fewer supports for this pawn on e5. If they can just keep hammering it, eventually the center will be gone. And then all those moves that white spent to establish a so-called big center, it'll all be for nothing. So what do you guys think is the next move? Dinesh, welcome. What should the next move be? Yeatermaster wants to play knight c6. So we've got one vote for knight c6. And there might be other moves. Any other votes? For black? I'm guessing Ari meant bishop f5. That seems very reasonable. Just developing your bishop right away. Saying, I have enough space for my pieces. I don't need to attack it more. Niketh, welcome. You're playing chess with your friend right now? Awesome. Like in real life on a board, or... Well, there's coronavirus, so maybe you should do it online. Alright, so knight c6 is a very reasonable move. And another move is c5. Let's take a look at knight c6 very quickly, because this is a good example of piece play against an unestablished center. So the center is vulnerable still for white. They have to keep protecting it however they can. In this example, or I'm sorry, in this position, white has more than one way of guarding d4. Bishop e3 is the best. What do you guys think is the problem with knight f3? What could go wrong here? By the way, Yeatermaster, if you play pawn c6 instead, this isn't challenging the center. In fact, it's obstructing your knight, so probably not. Let's take a look at knight c6 and knight f3 again. So what's the problem with this? What should black do to challenge the center more? And we're going to challenge the center with piece play. Dinesh has it, Yeatermaster has it. Yeah, bishop g4. That's right. So we're pinning the knight, and we're threatening to just remove the defender of the d-pawn. We're not going to miss that bishop. If you guys watched my other video about space, you would know that when you have less space, you generally want to trade a pair of minor pieces anyway. If you trade two pairs of minor pieces, practically any pawn structure can support the pieces that you have left. So trading this bishop for a knight, even though it gives up the bishop pair, it's very sensible since black doesn't have much space anyway. And on top of that, it comes with tactical threats. The center is collapsing in front of our eyes. So for that reason, after knight c6, they would play bishop e3, trying to kind of wait a little bit and see what black does. And actually, it's a really good idea to play bishop e3 here. I think knight c6 is not the best move in the position. We'll go back and see what the other one is. But the reason I think it's not the best is that here, black is at a crossroad where they want to use this bishop, but they wish they could pin the knight. But the knight's not out yet. And they want to use this bishop, but if they play e6, it traps the other bishop. Typical space advantage problems, or space disadvantage in black's case. They could play g6, but g6 is very slow. White can continue to play waiting moves and try to just force black to make a concession of playing e6. So in this position, usually bishop f5 is played, and black is saying, I have enough space for my pieces. And after knight c3, e6, knight f3, I think black is doing fine, but they can do better, so we'll see about that. So c5. This move is more to the point. We're just going to wreck that center right now, right here. And I guess if white wants to say, I have more space, they have to play d5. If you play this move, I actually didn't check this ahead of time. I think we should just trade queens and then play knight d7, and we're going to get one of these pawns back right away. And white's center obviously has collapsed. The pawns are far advanced, but they're just targets. They're not restricting black's pieces at all. Black's doing great. And the queen trade helps when you have less space. So c5 is a great move. You should remember these kinds of moves for destroying the center. And you usually have to act fast. If you play really slow, like with c6, white will consolidate. They'll develop all their pieces. Like, let's say you play e6 as well. Really slow. You're just saying, I'm going to try to stop d5. I'm not going to do anything else. They'll probably play... I don't know if we have time for a3. It seems logical, but I think I would rather just let you trade your good bishop. So let's say knight f3. And we just keep playing moves. Eventually, black is going to run out of good things to do, and white's just going to have a lot of space. So you have to strike right away, or else you'll get suffocated. That's the whole space advantage thing. So knowing if your gain of space is good or not, it depends on you noticing whether or not your center can get destroyed. So let's fast forward a little bit. This is an example where your center falls apart. Notice that white hasn't really moved any pieces yet. Next they played e6, attacking the center even more. I played knight c3 to try to get my pieces out. If I played d6, this looks really like spacious. I'm getting lots of space. But the d6 pawn is going to be a target long term. We can eventually undermine it with f6, and knight c6 is already saying, how are you going to protect e5? So d6 is not really very helpful. So that's why I played knight c3. And we traded, and it looks like I'm going to get a passed pawn or something, but it's totally irrelevant. Black has tons of ways to attack all those guys. And in this game, my opponent played c4. And this, it turns out, is kind of an interesting move, but black had maybe a better alternative in queen h4 check. Queen h4 really demonstrates how behind in development white is. It's pretty unusual to get checked with queen h4 as white when you play normal good moves. Here we would have to play g3, and luckily queen e4 is impossible, otherwise we would lose a rook. But after queen d4, they say a fool and his money are soon parted, right? So here it's like a space-greedy guy and his pawns are soon parted. If we trade, we're going to lose this pawn already. We're attacking the defender. And if we don't trade, we're losing our castling. Black is succeeding in trading more pieces. It's a complete failure of white's space-gaining strategy. We're not restricting anything. So this would have been even better. I would consider queen h4 the refutation of this line. All right, but let's see a little bit more. Queen h4. I'm sorry, c4 is an interesting move. Actually, so I misordered my variations. D takes e5 is what my opponent should have played. So we're going to go back to this point. My opponent actually played g6, so I'm going to bump this up. I accidentally took us down a sideline, thinking it was my actual game. It was a long time ago. So in the real game, they played g6, which is not the best. They should have played d takes e5 too. Immediately destroy the center. I played h3. All pawn moves. And eventually they started destroying the center, but first they developed their pieces. Bishop e6 is kind of dubious. But it's interesting how I got an extra move and still my position is very tenuous. Vedant's asking what study this game is on. So I'm not sharing the study just because I don't want people to copy my games and stuff. It's just private. But I'm going to show you guys everything, so you're not going to miss anything. So after bishop c8, he wasted 2 moves in a row basically, but still my center is collapsing. I played bishop d3, not the best move. Maybe bishop e2 is better. And here comes e6. So we already saw a lot of these undermining moves in the main lines that I just showed you. So let's go to the part where they just destroy the whole thing. In this position, I played bishop takes b6 to save my d-pawn. If I just take back, then knight takes d5 is winning material. So it's already a bad state. But this trade doesn't make it much better, because now black's rook is getting active, basically for nothing, just to avoid losing material. Alright, I've got a lot of space now, but the pawns are very vulnerable. In this position, there's no good move for white. Black is already much better. I played e6 to try to create some counterplay, but as you can see, black's pieces are all finding great squares. The e6 pawn's under attack, the knight is standing well on e5, and I was just trading to try to avoid material losses, and then eventually it all came crashing down in a big checkmating attack. What move do you guys think black should play here? It's probably more than one good move again, but I'm just curious about what you guys would play. What could it be? Lots of interesting options since black's pieces are all very active. Meanwhile, white is not using the rooks and the king's not castled. Alright, so Yeatermaster wants queen e7. Vedant wants queen h4. Any other votes? Alright, Yeatermaster wants queen h4 as well. Alright, and Ari Morrison. So it's unanimous for queen h4. We can take a peek at this. This is probably one of the good moves for sure. I think king d1 is forced. And after this, the only reason I'm hesitant is that my idea of playing e7 isn't gone. Maybe you could play king g7 and just keep developing. I think there's a little bit of counterplay for white here. Not much though, just a shred. I do want to point out that queen takes d3 runs into something that looks like e7 check. Even this is probably lost though. My idea was to play e8 queen if they play rook f7 and then give a checkmate or something. But even if they play like king g7, I would take and make a queen. But this position might even still be lost. That's just how bad it is. Like I could give a check and bishop f5 should stop all the checks for good. I just don't think that white's coming back even after making this great play with e7. So black can play basically anything. Black chose bishop g3 and I got totally wrecked very soon. Queen e7 is stopping my attack and my bishop got trapped very soon as well. Here, if I move my bishop somewhere good like d3, bishop takes e6 is crushing, so I just sacked the bishop and tried my best. My best was not very good, and that was the end. Like this, I had to sack a lot of material and got checkmated on b2. I made some desperate checks, but that was it. So this part I went really fast just because it's just easy checkmating. Like every move wins at this point. The critical part where I went wrong started with f4. This is a classic case of overextension. Black is able to activate all the pieces easily with a move like d takes e5. In this game, they didn't even do that. They played g6, which is certainly subpar, and they still managed to get a great position. And I'm also not using any of my higher value pieces. Basically, I'm trying to claim space, but I'm not able to support it. And this points us in the right direction for what we should do if we want to gain more space.